Okay, so I've already broken my book buying ban, which is disappointing, but a good thing to know about me is that I'm kind of obsessed with helping out small, independent, privately owned businesses, especially independent bookshops and coffee shops. There have been many times in the past around the country and around the world where I've gone into a small independent bookshop and just bought something because I had to help them out. I wanted them to succeed. I love small independent bookshops, especially ones that are themed in a particular way. Maybe they are radical bookshops, feminist bookshops, or queer bookshops. And I recently moved to Glasgow, which is home of the queer independent bookshop Category Is Books. I went in there, I had a chat with one of the owners, I was thrilled, I felt at home, it's an amazing place, amazing people, I'm joining a book club that they host, and since I'm a huge fan of Legends and Lattes and I was really excited for the sequel to come out, I had to pick it up from there. This is Bookshops and Bone Dust by Travis Baldree. I couldn't resist getting it. And I may have also picked up the books of Andrew Joseph White, a YA author whom I am very, very excited to finally check out because I hear great things, especially about this book here, Hell Followed With Us. So the big question is, was it worth it? Was it worth already breaking my book buying ban about a week into it? On the one hand, yes, absolutely, because I helped out an independent bookshop and I'm going to be visiting that bookshop a lot. Like I said, I'm joining a book club that they host, and they actually host two. But more specifically, was it worth buying this book in particular as a break from my book buying ban? That's actually kind of a tough question, because Bookshops and Bone Dust, I don't think, is as good as Legends and Lattes, but Legends and Lattes was a breakout, runaway hit of a debut novel from a really talented writer. Travis Baldree used to design video games, then he became an audiobook narrator, and I got to meet him at Comic-Con last year in London, which is where I discovered Legends and Lattes. I had a chat with him, and he said that although he mostly narrates fantasy books, he likes reading more cozy mystery books. And so he blended those two genres together in what turned out to be a massive hit, and now Legends and Lattes has a very dedicated fan base. People love that book. In the acknowledgements at the end of Bookshops and Bone Dust, he talks about how it was not the book he planned on writing. He wanted to write something else set in that same world that was going to be a kind of murder mystery. He wrote that murder mystery, didn't like it, and ended up writing something else instead, and that became Bookshops and Bone Dust, which is a prequel to Legends and Lattes, set 20 years before the events of that first novel. Viv, the orc barbarian protagonist, is a mercenary, and she's only just set out as part of a legendary mercenary group. She's in over her head, she's overeager, she's way too ambitious, she runs in headfirst, and that bites her in the arse. Or the leg. While fighting the minions of a necromancer that the mercenary group is after, Viv takes a really nasty wound in her thigh, and the mercenary group say, look, you're no good to us right now, you need to go rest somewhere. So they drop her off in a seaside town called Merk. They head on up north, following the trail of the necromancer, and promise to pick her up when they come back down. And so she's there for a few weeks, resting, recovering, and bored out of her mind. Now, I was a huge fan of Legends and Lattes. I am absolutely in that obsessive fandom. I think it's a wonderful book, kind of flawless for what it is. And Bookshops and Bone Dust, as I've already said, doesn't quite measure up to the impact that that book had. But impact is kind of an important thing. Is Bookshops and Bone Dust as good narratively, in terms of its themes and its characters and its events? It's actually hard to say that because it can be very difficult with so many books and films, video games, all kinds of media, to separate what we have now from the cultural impact of what came before. If a new Star Wars film comes out, you can't just judge it on its own merits as a film, you end up comparing it to previous Star Wars films. And not just comparing it to the films, but comparing it to the impact that they had, the power of the moment. Legends and Lattes really felt like something new, something exciting, something fresh and bold and beautiful. That impact is done. It's been made. Anything that comes after couldn't possibly have that same impact, even if it's just as good. And so if the book is just as good, it's still not going to feel as powerful. And I feel like that's a really important thing to just keep in mind, not just when it comes to what I'm talking about here, but anything at all, any kind of media. I would say that Bookshops and Bone Dust still has the heart of Legends and Lattes. All of the ingredients that made that first novel such a hit, the prequel has as well. It has a rich, exciting setting, it leans into high fantasy tropes, especially when it comes to types and races of characters. You've got orcs, you've got dwarves, you've got other things that may have been invented by Baldry or might be part of D&D or other high fantasy that I haven't read or played or whatever. For example, when Viv is lying in bed, bored, she leaves and goes for a walk to find out what's out there, and she stumbles across a very quaint little bookshop that's super duper run down. The bookshop is owned by a ratkin called Fern, and Fern is different from other ratkin. She swears a lot and she's quite brazen. She complains about how sailors come into port and they buy sea charts and they leave and no one buys the novels. And she stereotypes Viv and says, well, you're just a barbarian orc, you're not going to be interested in reading fiction. And Viv doesn't prove her wrong. She's right in her stereotyping of Viv, but she's also able to draw out the more sensitive inner side of Viv. The events of this book explain the Viv that we have 20 years later in Legends and Lattes. This is where the walls start to come down and she finds her sensitive side. Her, I don't want to say more intelligent side, but maybe more compassionate or empathetic side. She goes from someone who just swings a sword or an axe to someone who feels compassion and appreciates art and literature. Fern sets her a challenge. She hands Viv a book and roughly describes it and asks her to go away and read it and see what she thinks. The first book she reads is an adventure tale that she can empathize with, something that is very suited to her lifestyle, full of swords and sorcery. She comes back and she complains about the fight scenes, but says, yeah, they were still really fun and engaging. And then Fern asks her to talk more about the themes and the characters, the relationships, etc. Then Viv reads another book that's very different, a romance. She really struggles with it until about the halfway point when the relationships start to affect her on a deeper level. And she comes back and she talks to Fern about all of that. And suddenly you realize that Viv, at least for me, is kind of mirroring a lot of our experiences when it comes to reading. When you first get into books, maybe as a kid, a teenager, you read books that relate to whatever you're into. Books that are part of a genre that you already like. They are something that intrigues you in some way. For so many of us, it's often fantasy, science fiction, horror, and then we may move away from genre fiction or into other genres. We might start reading literary fiction, reading classics, reading gothic fiction, reading romance, whatever. And that's what happens to Viv, and it's what happened to me as I grew up, and that's why I now try to read as diversely as possible. Travis Baldry is teaching Viv and teaching the reader through Viv to do that. And that's really, really sweet. And it doesn't feel like a lesson that you're learning, it's just part of the narrative and it works really well. And as the story goes on, Viv meets more people. She starts a potential love affair with a baker who also runs her own little business. She enlists the help of a fellow orc to renovate the bookshop, carpet it, paint it, make it look more enticing. Fern eventually asks Viv if she will work at the bookshop in exchange for books and calls it her own personal library. And we go from there. Just like with Legends and Lattes, this is a very low-stakes, cozy fantasy novel. Not really a fantasy novel at all, just a cozy read set in a fantasy world, and that was the idea for Legends and Lattes too. That book had stakes, and Bookshops and Bone Dust does too, but the reason I don't think it's as good as Legends and Lattes is because those stakes aren't as compelling. The necromancer that Viv's mercenary group are following comes back into play. That is established pretty early on. There are hints that something's going on here. A weird, mysterious stranger comes into the bookshop and ends up getting into a fight with Viv. He's creepy, he's skulking around, stalking the town, what's he up to? And from here, more and more things start building up, and you can kind of predict where the book is going to go. And what's interesting about predicting where it's going to go is that we know that Viv won't stay in Merc. We know that she goes on to live the life of a mercenary until she decides to stop and open her own coffee shop 20 years from now. We know that. So we know that these friendships, relationships, we know that they're temporary. And that gives the book an air of heartbreak and sadness, which I'm sure Baldry is very aware of. And I find that intriguing, the idea that you know that this isn't going to last. But there is a problem with that. Even if the author is aware of this, and makes the audience aware of this, and creates that aura of sorrow that reminds us that nothing lasts. Even if he does all of that, there's still kind of the issue of what I'm going to call canon. Legends and Lattes represents a new start for Viv. We know she's had a long career as a mercenary, we know she's travelled and seen battles and gotten rewards and blah blah blah, but we're following a new beginning. Legends and Lattes is a new start for her. A new city, a new job, a business that she's opening, new friends, relationships, colleagues. It's all new, it's a start, it is a beginning. Bookshops and Bone Dust is not a beginning, but it's also not a sequel, it's a prequel. And so it kind of feels like a thing that floats. It doesn't feel too concrete. If you've ever watched anime, there are a lot of filler episodes in long-running anime that step outside of the main saga and just take a breather, a beach episode. And that's what this kind of feels like. It's a beach episode. It's not part of Viv's previous life because it's a break from that while she heals, and it's not part of her new life because it's 20 years earlier. So it does feel like it kind of floats, and that means that all bets are off. The stakes feel low even if they are high in the moment, because there's something in your mind going, none of this is part of her story. But then, as I said earlier, it very much is, because what happens to her in this book informs the version of Viv that we see in Legends and Lattes. An orc barbarian mercenary with a heart of gold, who ends up retiring to open her own shop, and I'm sure she got that idea from the bookshop in Bookshops and Bone Dust, so it all ties together really nicely. So I'm in two minds about it, because everything that happens in this book inspires her life going forward, but at the same time it doesn't feel like it's a part of her life, it feels like a beach episode, and it is literally set on a beach. It's a weird, nebulous kind of thing. As for its structure, as for its plotting, Bookshops and Bone Dust starts really, really strong. It has a very exciting prologue, a very funny opening few chapters. As the world builds itself around Viv and we meet more and more characters, it's all really exciting. And the ending is gorgeous. The last few chapters and the epilogue are perfect. I tore through that. But from the halfway point until the final act, there is kind of a second act lull that I struggled to get through at times, and I was really surprised by that because up until that point, that wasn't the case. And all the way through his first book, that wasn't the case. Baldry is clearly very good at editing. His pacing is really sharp and really tight. What's interesting about this book is that almost every single chapter is 8 pages long. Always 8 pages. I don't know if you do this, but whenever I start a new chapter, I just flick through to see how many pages that chapter is, to see if I have time to read it, because I don't like to stop a book in the middle of a chapter. And I would do it every time, and I would count 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 page turns, 8 pages, every single time. It was wild. And that keeps a nice pace going. But that also proves that chapters are not pacing, because the pacing does have a bit of an issue in the second half. This could now be a long-running series if Baldry wanted it to be. And I would read a third book very, very happily. But also, he clearly cares about these characters in this world. And the fear that I would have, at least, and I'm sure he would too, of creating a series out of this is, what if it becomes diluted? What if every single time everything matters a little bit less? Because one wonderful thing about Baldry is his use of language and his characterization. He's very imaginative with his descriptive language. It's gorgeous. There are some really, really funny scenes in here. The dialogue is funny, sure, but it's often down to the way things are described and set up by the narrator that I found really, really funny and charming and genuinely gorgeous. There are flourishes to his language that I think are beautiful, and I would hate for him to start churning out books and that become diminished, as well as the characters themselves becoming diminished. So we'll see if that happens, I have no idea. Continuing to build on this world with new characters and stories, as he originally planned to do with his second book, is perfect, and I'd love to see more of that. I'm curious to see what happens with Viv next, if anything at all. So overall, yes, I think I am glad that I broke my book buying ban to read Bookshops and Bone Dust. That was a lot of alliteration. Because I am invested in this world and these characters, I'm disappointed that it doesn't quite carry the weight of Legends and Lattes, but as I've already said, I think that's really, really hard to do because that book really felt like a kind of moment. And you can't... What's the thing about lightning in a bottle? I can't remember. Lightning doesn't strike twice? I don't know. Something about lightning. So it's really hard to do that again, and instead Baldry has just put out another wonderful book, returning to the life of Viv, but set before in a new place with characters that are just as charming and delightful as previously. He's a great writer, he's a great world builder, and he clearly cares about his characters because they are so full of wit and charm and love, and you'll get all of that here. So if you've never read Legends and Lattes or Bookshops and Bone Dust, and a cozy read set in a fantasy world sounds like your kind of thing, definitely check these out. And go support your local independent bookshop. And also subscribe for books.